We can go ahead and get started then. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for being here. Those of you that are here in person as well as on Zoom. I know we have a big crowd online this morning. We appreciate you attending our Chamber's seminar on the federal debt crisis and its impact on small businesses, presented by our partners at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. So I'd like to thank both Amanda and Mike as well from CRFB for joining us today. We're fortunate that you all are headquartered down the road, so we could have you here with us in person today. Our presenter is Mike Murphy, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief of Staff for CRFB, where he manages policy research and analysis on a variety of topics related to fiscal policy and the federal budget, as well as coordinates a wide array of projects related to advancing the committee's policy-related initiatives. He is also the director of Fix US, a special initiative of the committee that seeks to better understand the root causes of our nation's growing divisions and deteriorating political system, to work with others to bring attention to these issues and the need to fix them, and to build support for necessary changes. So thank you, Mike. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. So, say right down the road, takes a little while. But it's great to be with you all, and it's sort of love speaking with chambers, groups, obviously business leaders. I think for a variety of reasons, maybe share an affinity to the topic that I'm going to speak to you about today. And I'm going to cut right to the end. We need some help. We could use some help in terms of raising attention to the topic I'm about to talk to you today and encouraging our federal policymakers to get on it. Right. So hopefully we got a decent block of time here. As groups like us tend to do, I have a slide presentation that has a lot of graphs and charts and numbers to try to portray the challenge I'm here to talk to you about today. But hopefully I'll get through that relatively quick and we can just have a discussion and questions from you all from those in the room, and maybe we can facilitate online if we can figure out that as well. So first, before I get into it, here's a little precursor about myself. I'm not an economist. I don't have a background in economics. I do have a background in public policy, but I did not get into this due to affinities or the real deep weeds of numbers and economic policy. I got into this issue I'm going to talk to you about today because for a quaint, sort of simple idea from a public policy perspective, I think that a budget should be, I'm not making up this line, others have said it too. A budget should be a statement of values. And when one looks at the federal government's budget, there's lots of different things people might be able to glean about what our nation values in that regard. But one thing's very clear in terms of what it values. And that is it values debt. It values financing our past at the expense of our future. And so that's the kind of broader principle sort of gotten into this. I believe that is a really dangerous value proposition for the federal government and the biggest nation. And many argue the most powerful nation in the history of the world has put itself in. So
I'm just gonna change the screen. Okay.
Okay. Good.
That should be fine.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, yes.
So I'm going to walk through a presentation that kind of puts this in perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are right now, how we got here, in many ways more importantly where we're headed, and the consequences of this for the American people, our broader economy, and other factors. So, put it simply, to start this off, yeah, we're spending a lot more than we take in at the federal level right now. We spend approximately $7 trillion annually, but this year, fiscal year, projected to only take in about 5.2 trillion only. Okay, but relative to that, I'm obviously on the spending side, which leaves a massive gap from a deficit perspective. There you go. The deficits really spiked a few years ago during COVID, as we responded to COVID. In a variety of ways, obviously, at the federal level, they came down from huge historic levels from an annual deficit perspective, but they're still very, very high, obviously, and are projected to grow for the years to come. With those federal deficits comes debt. A lot of people actually just kind of interchangeably use deficits and debt all the time, but obviously you two different things. But our debt is accumulation of all our past deficits over time. Lots of people, when they think of our national debt, they think we're talking about mainly they kind of focus on that massive, it's almost $37 trillion in gross national debt, kind of on the debt clock up there at Times Square in New York, seen that. And well, we actually look at a different metric. Business folks might get it more attuned to this more easily. We look at actually our outstanding public debt on the markets relative to the size of our economy. It's debt as a percentage of our GDP measure. There's lots of reasons we look at that as a core metric. It allows you to measure it over time, measure it compared to other countries. But most importantly, it's a measure that kind of has a measure of your debt to some statistic as an underlying resources to finance that debt or underlying economy, obviously, in this sense. And when you look at it by that measure, we have debt levels in this country approaching levels we've never seen. The only other time in this nation's history we had debt that approaching these levels was right after World War II. The big difference is during World War II, we were borrowing to defend the free world. It was also projected to come down after World War II, which it did. Now we are actually borrowing, obviously not to defend the free world, we're borrowing for our consumption largely, which I'll get to in a second. And it's not projected to come down, it's actually projected to keep going up and up and up as far as projections can go. And with ever increasing debt comes interest costs. Interest costs at the federal level are now the fastest growing line item in the federal budget. They are approaching levels we haven't seen in quite some time. On this chart, you're seeing them both as a percentage of our economy, but also the orange line is showing it, and on the right side is a percentage of total federal spending budget. As you can see, we spend over 50, almost 60% of the federal budget itself, that big $7 trillion figure, total budget on interest expenses, and it is growing fast, as I said, as a line item and exceeding other things that we spend in the federal budget. So it already exceeds on an annual basis what we spend on Medicaid. It exceeds what we spend on Medicare. Just last year, it exceeded for the first time annually what we spend on defense. So we spent more on interest on national debt in a given year than defense. And a lot of those interest payments do go overseas. What you're seeing right now is just who owns our debt. Therefore, where the pace, some of those principal interest is going towards. And it's a lot of different, obviously, sources, and most of it is domestic. It is, but we borrow in our own. You know, the Federal Reserve has bought up a lot of debt from a monetary policy perspective, but other domestic holders and pension funds, mutual funds, et cetera. But a decent amount of it does go overseas, including to China, as you see there, bottom, and other countries that may not share our interests. Pivoting to how we got to that. So this chart, and the next two charts are from a study that my organization did about a year ago. And essentially what it tried to do is go back to, a lot of people bring up the fact that we had surpluses not too long ago in the 6-6-3. Yeah, we had annual surpluses in the late 90s, early 2000s, which seems an incredible long time ago in the context of budget policy. But we did have surpluses. So we did a little study of how do we get from surpluses to what we're facing now. And you're going to see two slides on this. Here's the first one is, look, this is actually kind of simple how we got here. We've had a series of unpaid for spending increases, tax cuts that were not offset with other reductions in spending to account for them. Responses to recessions, including in the late 2008, 2009, which we had to borrow to respond to that, as well as COVID, foreign conflicts that were put on the nation's credit card. So many of these things all added up to going from surpluses to ever increasing deficits of debt over the last 2+ decades. And then we looked at it by votes. And both parties have had a hand in doing this. As you can see, there's a lot of purple on this chart. We looked at a lot of the major legislation that led to those changes on the previous chart. And many of them, obviously, overwhelming majority of the impact was bipartisan votes that got us here. So neither party obviously has their hands clean when it comes to worsening our fiscal trajectory. Pivoting a little bit in terms of where we are now, I talked about how we got here. Now pivoting a little bit to the story going forward. The story going forward is actually something that kind of budget nerds, people who talk about this for a while, kind of known about for a long time. But going forward, what we have is a major structural deficit. What I mean by that is that the spending that's built into the budget going forward is largely driven by three things. So you see on this chart, this is the projected spending built into that federal level. And it's about 87% can be explained by three things. It can be explained by healthcare programs, Social Security growth, and that interest expense that just keeps growing. And those three things account for 87% of the built-in spending growth at the federal level. And it's due to, again, known trends that we've known about for a long time. Our society is aging. Shortly after Social Security was created decades ago, we had 16 people in the workforce paying into these programs for every one person on them. Due to the aging of society, lower birth rates, etc., we now have that ratio that's gone down to 3 to 1, and it's going to 2 to 1. And these programs are, in many cases, Social Security in particular, pay-as-you-go financing. So the current workers pay for the current beneficiaries in large part. And when that ratio is out of whack, it really creates big problems in the financing of the programs. We also have significant foregone revenues, if this is the way to think about it, in our tax code. So now a lot of I am going to talk about in a few minutes, the big beautiful bill that just passed. So there's a lot of implications on many of the things we're talking about in here, which we'll come back to. So some of these charts are frankly a little bit outdated. We haven't updated them to account for some of the numbers of some of the policy changes in these things, but this one is largely still true from a broader personal perspective. In the tax code, a lot of what's built into the tax code in the form of what's called tax expenditures. These are numerous amounts of deductions, exclusions, exemptions, credits across a range of obviously categories. So I don't need to tell you all that from business perspective. But what these are in many cases can be thought of in different ways as spending through the tax code, because they benefit different constituencies in different ways. They could just be designed as doing a spending program, but they're put into the tax code instead. The result of many of these tax expenditures adds up to roughly almost $2 trillion built into the code annually in these tax expenditures. Now we can come back to solutions in a little bit, but one of the biggest argued solutions to clean this up, we can lower rates, be more pro-growth while cleaning out a lot of these exemptions, result in a win-win for everybody, more growth, more revenue for the federal government. What is the result of all these mounting deficits and debt? This is perhaps the biggest challenge, I would argue, for groups like ourselves, is trying to talk about all these scary numbers and why they actually matter. Trillion sounds bad, but don't really why. Right? Why does this really matter? And the reality is, there's actually a ton of consequences of this, but none of which maybe are going to fit on a bumper sticker, so to speak, or are going to kind of be that glaring headline that everyone's going to notice. There are economic impacts of this. Higher deficits, more deficit spending. We've seen this in recent years can put upward pressure on inflation. It can put and does put upward pressure on interest rates across the broader economy. It slows economic growth, income growth. So the more public borrowing there is out there, private investment in the economy lead to lower economic growth and wage growth. It has national security implications. As I said before, the more you're spending on interest, which you have to spend, is crowding out your ability to spend on other things. As I said before, including defense, right? So it's just limiting your flexibility as a government to be able to respond effectively, nimbly to crises, whether they're domestic or foreign. As I said before, we also borrow from other countries, including some that don't share our interests, which also puts us at risk. We have, we're going to come back to this in a second, but as I said before, some of the biggest program drivers here of spending are things like Social Security, Medicare, those programs in and of themselves serve vitally important purposes in our economy. They're also incredibly popular, but they are on the road to insolvency in and of themselves. And so therefore, failing to get our fiscal house in order can have dire ramifications for the folks that depend on those programs. The last two I'll cover briefly here on the consequences is the increased risk of a quote fiscal crisis. So this is like the doomsday scenario that people think about when they talk about not getting our fiscal house in order. Other countries throughout history have succumbed to this fate. It's not something you want to attempt. Essentially, the theory / argument goes is that eventually you don't get your fiscal house in order. Those that lend you money on the bond markets will eventually just say, yeah, I don't think that they're credible anymore, and therefore going to demand very precipitously, very quickly, very unexpectedly a higher interest. And again, probably not happening today, not going to happen this year. But you keep going down this path, I think it's pretty inevitable that could happen. You so understand where the path is headed here. And the last consequence I'll say, and going back to sort of what I said at the beginning about why I care about this stuff, to me, this is also a moral issue. I think it's completely unfair when you realize that this is happening. You realize you're gonna have to get ahead of this. You realize that you can get the power compounding work for you, if you start this earlier. Keep punting these inevitable decisions the future generations who are already going to face a much more competitive, much more challenging work environment, economic environment than we have today. And we're just punting these choices to future generations. I talked a little bit about Social Security and the trust fund, so I want to talk about this just for a couple minutes, because as I foreshadow a little bit of solutions, kind of what things our organization is doing, trying to get others focused on. This is one of them. We're really trying to bring attention to the unsustainable nature of our big popular social insurance programs, their trust funds that are on a path to solvency. So Social Security, as I said it before, one of the most I think it is the most popular federal program based on polling, and it serves vital purpose in our economy. It provides, I think it's for over half of people on Social Security. For over 40% of people on Social Security provides over half their income. I mean, it provides a vital purpose to people. But it's on a path to insolvency. So within 7 years or so, the trust funds will run out of its reserves. They will no longer be able to pay scheduled benefits due to incoming revenues no longer matching expenses. And by law, when that happens, they have to match spending to revenues, and that would necessitate across the board, everybody on the program cut of estimated 24%. And we equate that to being about 18,000 or so for a average median income couple on the program in that year, that $18,000 benefit cut. And again, similar to our fiscal debt situation, there's lots of reasons why you should not wait to that deadline. Get this. You can phase in inevitable changes. The changes will be smaller if you do them now versus if you do them in 2032, 33. It allows people time to adjust, plan for them, plan their own retirement savings differently, et cetera, et cetera. There's so many smart reasons to do it now, but because it's the most popular program, it also is arguably the most demagogue program at the federal level. We have now both parties in complete unity in saying, we're not touching this program, we're not talking about it for obvious political reasons, but it really puts the program at risk to put a fine point on it. Anyone who says they're not touching this program, their plan was essentially a 24% cut in 7 years, because that's where this is headed, and we need to continue to draw more attention to it. I'll spend a couple of minutes before kind of talking about other things we're doing with solutions that we solve this, to talking about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that just passed Congress. We have lots and lots of information on our website on the Big Beautiful Bill Act, lots of things that just explain kind of what's in it, just all different policies, so huge, massive piece of legislation. obviously, there's still a lot, I think we should talk, obviously, all the elements of it, what's in there, it was just a huge piece of legislation. But from our organization's perspective, the thing that we were concerned about with this bill is we believe, contrary to assertions of some, we believe this, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will worsen this budget situation over the next several years. We believe that the extensions of the tax cuts that were included in this bill were not offset with sufficient spending reductions. There were significant spending reductions in this bill, but they were not offset enough to cover that gap. And many claim that they will generate economic growth from these tax cuts that will offset that, but estimates from across the political spectrum on the outside have said that they're not going to generate enough economic growth to cover that. So we're concerned that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act will worsen the fiscal situation that I just showed you previously, will increase those associated interest costs that I talked about earlier, to the tune of reaching almost $2 trillion annually in interest costs as a result of this over the next 10 years. And kind of when put in perspective to other pieces of legislation recently, was a significant deficit increase. Right now, you're seeing a chart that we had for a few weeks ago. We're seeing a chart that shows at the very top, it says Senate One Big Beautiful Bill Act, House One Big Beautiful Bill Act. That's because people were following this debate. Pretty contentious at times, but things were ping-ponging a little bit. And they had a House that passed a bill that was slightly more fiscally responsible than the bill that came out of the Senate. The bill that came out of the Senate was the one they ultimately signed into law right before the 4th of July. And yeah, as you can see, we believe it's going to increase deficits by trillions of dollars. You'll see a little piece up there that little part of the bar chart there that says if made permanent. The real quick story on that is that there are a lot of provisions in this bill that have things expiring, say in 2028. All right. A lot of the no tax on tips, overtime, some of those policies in particular, they expire in 2028. The reason that they do that, people will argue various reasons why they did it, but the core reason why they did it is to keep the costs down. Because if you say it expires in 2028, you don't have to count the full 10-year budget costs. That's how you do this. So what you see there is if made permanent, because we make an assumption. I'm not sure those taxes cuts are going to go away until 2028. So if you assume they're actually intended to be permanent, then the cost, the sticker price of this actually goes up, and that's what's showing there too. So yeah, we're concerned that it's going to increase deficits at a time when we obviously believe we need to be getting our debt under control. And then that's what I'll pivot to here, last slide or two here before I open it up, is on solutions. This obviously sounds really dire. Sounds pretty rough situation, but many groups like us are trying to keep on, trying to push people to get this under control. These are principles of solutions. They're not like the detailed policy blueprint plan. We do have one of those, for instance, but these are more principles. Principle number one: stop making it worse. Sounds like a simple principle, but it really is important. It actually is why we were so adamant trying to work with Congress and administration to make this Big Beautiful Bill Act fiscally responsible. When you're in a hole, stop digging. That's the principle. And unfortunately, both parties do not tend to adhere to this principle. What I say here is, in fact, we need actually a super PAYGO principle. Okay, what that means is PAYGO is kind of what it sounds like. There's supposed to be a PAYGO principle, which is stop making the hole deeper. Well, we need something. You actually need to go further than that now, given the context of this hole. You actually need to be paying for things, and so right. So if you have a bill that costs $500 billion or so, you should pay for that $500 billion and put a few $100 billion more down payment to sort of get this debt under control. It's a super PAYGO principle, is what we call it. So we gotta adhere to that principle. Encourage policymakers to adhere to that principle. You need to set a goal. I'm gonna come back to this on the next slide. But you have to have a fiscal goal. You have to have a goal of what it is you're trying to achieve with this. And lots of people think a big goal is a balanced budget. Just preview the next slide. We're far away from getting a balanced budget. But there's other goals you can have. One goal we think is actually pretty is one that we're pushing. And we're aligned actually with the members of the administration on this goal and some others is a goal of getting our deficits as a percentage of our economy to about 3%. Do that, due to economic growth, different factors, you can start to stabilize that debt as a percentage of GDP ratio I showed earlier. We think that's a more reasonable, realistic goal than balancing the budget. You need bipartisan solutions to attack the drivers. I said some of these healthcare programs, social security, et cetera, are the drivers of structural gap. So you need to look at the drivers of this on the healthcare side in particular. There are some bipartisan ideas out there that people need to start to focus attention on. I'm certainly not suggesting it's easy politically, but that's you gotta go where the money is. I guess it's where the point here. You may need to establish quote unquote commissions to look at some of these things. Lots of people think establishing commissions is maybe a punt or a process, but because of some of the political realities of this and the need to do these in a bipartisan way, establishing some fiscal commissions that force members of both sides to sit down, and very importantly, it has to have a commission that would have some teeth in it. So if they reach an agreement, it automatically is guaranteed a vote, fast track some of the procedures in the Senate. There's ways you can design this, that the commission could have some teeth to attack these things. I alluded to this earlier. We are organizationally building and planning to launch what we're calling our Tell the Truth About Social Security campaign. Now to tap into sort of our national media actions to try to get this word out there. I told this story before the event starts, but we do some work in states and places around the country and work with media outlets. And we were talking to a media outlet in New Hampshire, a radio program, talking about Social Security, and the host cut me off and said, "Stop you right there. What we need to do," and you can, the media, was anytime they have a candidate, in New Hampshire, candidate for Senate next year, but also for president up there in particular, anytime they have a candidate come through, we need to ask them one simple question. The question is, what is your specific plan to save Social Security? We said, don't give me any BS. Said, no, don't give me any BS. Don't tell me you're not touching it. Who's not touching it is guaranteeing a 24% cut 7 years. I sat there and went, that sounds good. Let's go. So that's exactly what we need to do. And so we're building off that. We're going to try and launch a campaign to get folks to tell the truth about the state of Social Security and encourage folks to get involved with us on that. And then I alluded to this when I said blueprint before. We do have the Committee for Responsible Budget, and we're actually updating it next few months. We have a blueprint of how you can solve this, get the debt on down the path. It's not that we're saying it's the be all and end all solution. It's just our way of putting something out there that shows a kind of policy framework that will get this under control, that tackles healthcare, retirement programs, and the tax code, et cetera. And so that's on our website, but there's lots of different plans out there. The broader point is you need to have a plan and you need to get on it. And then this is what I was talking about when it comes to fiscal goals. And I'm gonna hope to end here in a way that sort of paints a little bit of paints this a little bit more realistic than otherwise it's. So you're looking at a chart that talks about what various goals they could be, and then the associated savings you need to meet those goals. Now, again, I need to update this. This actually needs to be updated post one big beautiful bill, so there actually need to be more savings around. But for the point of this discussion, it'll serve as illustrative. So if you look at some of these goals, it tells you how much in savings you need to reach those goals. So if you're going for like a balanced budget as a goal, you look at the far bottom right, you can see some goals of what savings you need over a 10-year period to get there. And you have on budget versus full budget. The difference there is you account for Social Security. But in either sense, you're looking at significant savings, 13 trillion, almost $17 trillion in 10-year savings, which is a significant, obviously, amount of money. But if you look at that 3% deficit target, which is a little bit higher than that, that's about 7.5 trillion. It's going to be higher than that now, but put that in context. Again, going back to the very first slide, that's 7.5 trillion or so on an annual budget that spends 7 trillion. Right? We are projected to spend over 10 years at the federal level about 89 trillion. So you put that sort of savings amount, you can think about it, get both sides of the ledger, plus generate growth, but economic growth gets you revenue too. Starts to be more manageable when you put that context on a bottom line, that's almost 90 trillion spending. To achieve, 8 trillion savings. That's roughly what we would need based on these, again, it'll be a little higher than the one we do for the bill. I'm gonna leave this chart up here while we're talking, just so. These are various facts I think I already covered, but they're just a bunch of select facts and figures that relate to the topic. Again, I'll kind of I'll close where I started. I think that we obviously care about this issue a lot for all the numerous reasons that I outlined on that one slide about consequences. But we need help. We need help, and we need a willingness for folks that are leaders in the community, that have the ears of policymakers that are willing to tell them, yeah, this issue is important to us. We know it's politically hard, but we got your back. We will speak out and defend you if you want to make some tough votes on this. And that's what I make a plug for you, hopefully be willing to do. If anyone wants to get more involved in these efforts, just get hard, when we have it after, and I will definitely loop you in, and you can reach out to me anytime as well. So with that, questions? Dennis?
Mike, if I could kick it off, you also mentioned the fact that a lot of times when you're talking to younger people, they'll say, well, I'm not worried about it because Social Security is not going to be there. But it's not true. Social Security, according to the actuarial, is going to be available out through 2021. Is that your understanding?
So both, yeah, you're accurate on all counts. So yes, younger generations are, well, they're incredibly cynical about the federal government and its political system in general, but in particular as it relates to Social Security, yeah, they're just completely cynical about it. They obviously they feel in many cases they're far away from it, so they're probably not thinking about it, but also they just know, they just have this sense of people talking about it for years that it's in trouble. They don't think it's going to be there for them. They think they're very, very cynical about it. When in reality, it's going to be there. It's just it's the finance gap. It's going to be cut by 24% if we don't do anything. Which let's be serious. They're going to do something. No politicians going to allow 24% cut to happen. Social Security, I don't think so. But unfortunately, what I think is going to happen is they're going to borrow for it, right? Which basically makes this whole just as bad. That's just not acceptable, and also just makes Social Security another kind of political football they've just kind of pumping around for years, which is not good. So it's not that it's certainly not going to go away. It's just that financial risk of not being able to pay full schedule benefits, and so we need to acknowledge that cynicism, younger folks, but try to get them engaged on this, because it is obviously the most living therapies.
Political strategy tactics to try to get some kind of attention to this, because as you said, it just goes back and forth. It is the political football, specifically on the whole Social Security thing.
Yeah.
What is it? Any thoughts? You must have thoughts, strategy on how we're tackling politically, because that is the solution, right? I mean, we've got to get these elected officials, federal elected officials, to address this thing, even acknowledge it. I mean, the plan to not touch it is in fact a plan to eliminate it or reduce it by 24% in 7 years.
Right.
So how does that message get spread or communicated, or how does that become a campaign issue from your perspective?
I think it's well, first of all, it's really hard, but we don't use an organization that tends to be against it with this kind of going uphill. That being said, but on a political standpoint, I think it's you got to use the election windows, right? So you have an election window that is upon us. There's a lot of speaker on here in 2026.
Right.
one of this tends to be the case in our organization too, where the numbers get worse, the things get worse, that maybe you can use that to your benefit. So the thing that's getting a little worse here now is the timing of this. They actually, we just did this analysis last week, where we estimate the result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act does have, even though it doesn't address Social Security directly, it has some impacts, spillover impacts on the trust funding revenue side, and therefore it actually is moving up the date of insolvency. The trustees have projected that the Social Security program will go insolvent in 2033. We project that the One Big Beautiful Bill Act moves that 2032 by a year. That puts it in the 6-year term of anybody that's being elected in December next year. It without a doubt puts it in the 4-year term of whoever's running for president. So some of this is now getting folks that are following the political circles, phone, media standpoint is you have to use the fact that this is going to be now in the term of those being elected to the Senate, demand that they should have an answer. Now, having said that, the reality of the situation is if someone running for the Senate, say next year, was to come out with their 10-point plan of say Social Security, they're gonna get 20, okay? And so therefore, the reality is that an answer that's closer to along the lines of that we need to prioritize it, it has to be a top plan, we have to do it sooner rather than later. The scope of a plan, there's lots of ideas out there, you kind of get a illustrative options of things that were proposed by commission things in the past. But the political reality is you probably also might benefit from a commission on this as well. Because you need to force both parties to come together. You need to be able to allow them to skip cover a little bit. To say,
Wouldn't you think both sides would welcome that cover?
not when the benefit of having it out there is an issue to hammer the other side outweighs the benefit of trying to solve it. So that's the paradigm that has to be shifted. So you have to have enough people understanding that this moment is coming, that the negative ramifications are real, try to shift this, use the political window to shift it a little bit too. And the last thing I'll say on this to kind of give a little bit of hope from a tactical perspective, or what have you, is this we didn't do it. So one, although we have a lot of polling, another group did polling on this that we work with closely. And they found that even though kind of it's been talked about, it's kind of been out there for years that the Social Security was in trouble. Huge majority, plus 70%, have no idea that this insolvency date is coming. They have no idea it's coming in only a few years.
The general population.
Right, and once you tell them that, their willingness to talk about changes to it changes. Okay, it goes from not being open to it to, oh, well, yeah, but we obviously have to talk about these things. So that is both unfortunate in some senses, but also positive in the sense that it gives you an opportunity to know you get the message out there hopefully the right way. It might get to the other point, might be able to flip that dynamic. But the paradigm is, okay, we actually need to solve this as opposed to using it as a bludgeon for fear mongering.
If you added state and local debt onto that debt to GDP ratio, in addition to like funding liabilities through like the pension benefit guarantee program, what does that number get to? Any idea?
I honestly don't know what the number is now. It's huge. The line I steal from others on this kind of issue here is sort of a bad news slows down hill. Sort of framing metaphor, whatever. It's, you know, the state and local governments, some are much better than others, right? But state and local governments got their own financial problems too. And state and local governments are heavily dependent on the federal level. Became very, very dependent, more so during COVID, some of the aftermath of COVID, some of the funding that was in some of the COVID relief bills. And when one understands the federal level ramifications of what the inevitable sort of adjustments that are gonna happen over time, that's gonna spill over into state and local budgets too. So that the state and local governments that are more prepared, they're kind of getting ahead of that, are gonna be much better positioned. In addition, we kind of alluded to this too. again, not the same for every, lots of states are better than others, what have you. State and local governments also face similar challenges in the sense that many of their problems are driven by the same things. They are dealing with legacy pensions, old age, retiree healthcare benefit programs, inadequate different, tax codes, revenue streams that may not face. Many places that have tried to gimmick and hide their sort of pension obligations that then pumped things in the future that have come back to bite them in different places. So there are parallels. The word I was, there are definitely parallels. But the bigger point which you're getting at is, yeah, this isn't only a federal issue. But the federal issue is going to spill itself into state and local budgets, and the state and local governments get out ahead of that. To prevent that, and work with the federal level to come up with a comprehensive ways to do it.
Which Europe's debt to GDP?
Europe's as a whole, it's individual countries, so.
Or European Union measure, is that?
It's there are individual countries' debt levels. I mean, Greece is very high, Italy's very high, higher than ours. The highest debt to GDP in the world is Japan.
Right.
Yeah, it's well over 200. So I'm not sure if I honestly don't know if the average use for that almost, yeah, they vary, some are lower, some are higher.
We have a question from the chat. It says, what would happen if the age for social security was raised 2 years, entry to 64, full retirement age to 68, max social security to 72? Would this fix it, and for how long? The same question also applies to Medicare. What if the age for entry was raised?
It would certainly help. I don't know that specific solution, I don't know the exact modeling it, but most of the retirement age solutions, I'm not sure if they said it, but part of the issue has to do with how you get phased in. Right, so a lot of the retirement age adjustments, they face it over time. It's not like we're gonna say tomorrow, we're raising those ages, they'll raise them by a month, et cetera, over several decades. But they have significant impacts on the solvency. You kind of look at the actuarial gap that they close, I think those might close a quarter to a third, depending on the estimates of the gap. So the retirement age solutions are usually, those are double-edged swords, so to speak, in these things. They tend to be one of the most common ones that comes up when you're having discussions like this. There's a lot of people think that they kind of fit a kind of common sense test in some sense. Look at sort of the way Social Security changed, that our life expectancy has grown, all these kind of things, maybe adjust for that. So a lot of the times it comes up. It also is the one that those that are against any changes like to zero in on just attack and fear monger as a terrible solution. But there's lots of other solutions that are commonly put forward for Social Security, not in addition to that. I think the other one that is most commonly put forward that some people are surprised polls incredibly well on both sides of the political aisle is actually generating more revenue from the program by adjusting the cap of how much people pay into Social Security. As you probably will know, right now the cap is set at about 180,000 roughly for an individual. So once you reach 180,000, you stop paying in Social Security for that given year. You don't get benefits above it either, and that's intentionally designed. It's designed to be a social insurance program that benefits those at the lower end of the spectrum. But there have been numerous proposals over the years. We haven't adjusted that cap for the makeup of total wages in the economy in decades. So there's proposals to raise that cap, adjust it to different levels. Some people want to lift it entirely. That could bring in a lot of revenue, doesn't solve the whole problem, it brings in a lot of it. But you also have to make some decisions. If you lift that cap, are you crediting benefits too above that cap or not? And there's lots of technical things you got to decide. But that one is always on the table, trying to be shot as if not part of an ultimate Social Security solution. And there's other things to try to make the benefit formulas a little bit more progressive in different ways. In other words, slowing the growth of benefits for those at the wealthier end of the income spectrum. Slowing the growth, not cutting them, like benefits actually scheduled to grow faster than underlying inflation. So relatively speaking, people will be getting more benefits years from now than they get today, based on where the benefit is. So it's slowing the growth of benefits for certain people, do several of these things, you can solve social security.
You mentioned that there's more information on the Big Beautiful Bill on the website. Without getting too far into the weeds, do you have a brief thumbnail overview of what small businesses should be concerned about?
I think that small businesses, will, there's benefits to stuff. When the tax cuts, there's gonna be some benefits on the small business side, and I'm not gonna discount that. The broader impact that we focus on is the broader economic impact that we believe is gonna come to bear as a result of this being fiscally irresponsible, which will therefore impact, obviously, small businesses. We think that I alluded to this earlier, I'll dig in a little bit more to it. So there are, when you store the impact of a bill like this, right? So it's just from a budget standpoint, what's the budget impact? When you look at the budget impact, outside impact, taxes, spending, revenues, it gives you a score. This Congressional Budget Office is the group that does this. For Congress, but then outside groups like ourselves and several others do their own models and estimates. The often criticism is, but when you do those scores, you don't take into account the quote dynamic effects, you don't take into account the economic growth benefits that will come from these policies. And the reality is, again, 7, 8, 10 outside estimates across the political spectrum would estimate the dynamic effects of this. Show that it doesn't come close to covering a gap. I think the best was about, that's right, I think like 800 billion or so in additional revenue from growth effects. Again, on a gap of, 4 trillion or less, but or maybe 5 trillion if you think it's permanent. It's not covering that gap. To go back to your question, the Congressional Budget Office actually found that it would have negative dynamic economic effects over the period. And the reason is they felt that the increased debt resulting from this will raise interest rates so much that it'll have negative impacts on the economy that will outweigh any economic benefits. Therefore, tying back to your question, of that would negatively, we feel, affect small businesses more than maybe any of the what makes be seen as the tax benefits of the bill for them. Other questions? Madison.
Yeah, one other thought, as I've been thinking about this, talking to people, small business, most small business people finance their own retirement. Right now, so you're not relying. And so when you're talking to small business people or the average person, it's hard to wrap your head around $37 trillion. They don't understand. What people understand is you gotta make it personal that this 24% cut Social Security is something that's very real. What I'm suggesting is we need a grassroots, people to people. I talk to a lot of people, I bring this up in conversation just to make them aware of it. They're not aware of it. And the more people we get talking about it, I think it'll start to get traction. What I worry about, getting back to your original point, I'm very disappointed in the political class and the fact that they're using us and it's worse on social media. And it doesn't matter what party you're in, we're all being used, which really gets me pretty upset, frankly. But what we've got to do is get people to understand it, start talking about it to get a groundswell. Because what could happen, getting back to your point, the closer in we get, the politicians will take advantage of us by creating it. When the hysteria hits, it'll justify whatever decision. So now is the time, we've got to get this grassroots, you got to hold all parties accountable.
We I'm 100% with you. One of the underlying reasons we decided we want to really try to make a case on Social Security is pretty much exactly what you were saying. Start your comments there, but we're trying to recognize that the debt issue itself is abstract, those are people's heads. But it doesn't take too long to explain to somebody. Social Security is running out of money, it's going to have to be cut by 24% in a few years, and the sooner you deal with it, much better. Then people go, oh, that's, right, because they know what Social Security is, they can't make sense of the broader debt effect. So that is exactly what we want to try and focus on, we want to try to do what we can to inspire more grassroots attention, we just had a staff retreat the other day. After the one big beautiful bill stuff was done, we've been kind of in replanning mode, this one would do. So we were talking a lot about this kind of effort, Dennis, and you know, it's a lot of creative ideas, like from staff that, like, you know, others try to draw attention to this. One of my favorites is maybe put some money behind some ads to try to encourage some grassroots. It's very creative ad ideas. One in particular, I had the idea of like what was it, like it's a construction crew that's gonna be taking out 24% of seniors' house or something. Yeah, it's just like something to like try to drive home the message in different creative ways. But I think it's a bad thing this is occurring, but it does create an opportunity to try to generate attention in ways that groups like us haven't tried before. I think we would. Yes.
I noticed that we've talked a lot about the tax and government revenue side of this. And I imagine that's somewhat that your organization, based on what I know of you, you're a little bit agnostic on that point, but are there other groups doing some thought leadership around how we can better tax to meet the moment? I mean, I don't think it's a surprise that, you know, global wealth is so much more fungible now than it was even 10, 15 years ago. That's going to require a bit of thought around how governments generate revenue writ large.
So, first off, you're correct in terms of agnostic point. We are agnostic on the overall specific solution that you're gonna have to get to solve this. That being said, we've had an institutional point of view for a long time. That anyone that does the math on these things, we have yet to see someone come up with a credible plan that would do this all on the spending side of the budget, right? That you would, the only way that people tend to make that work is they blow up their sort of economic growth assumptions on the one side and just generate so much revenue that's sort of like, okay, we can cut spending. Most, but even then, it's sort of like you're lowering federal spending levels to levels that haven't been there in like decades. Okay, so like I think that so that being said, it's kind of like maybe agnostic on solution while recognizing everything needs to be on the table, including the revenues. On the revenue side, you get it through oversimplification here, but two ways. You're generating more pro-growth policies, so that's a benefit bringing some revenue. But yeah, you gotta look at the tax code, you gotta figure out ways to generate more revenue in a more economically efficient, more equitable, or horizontally and vertical equity, for those terms, right? Efficient ways. And right now, our tax code is the most freaking Swiss cheese mess of a thing. They actually just made it worse. Right, all these different carve outs, the tips and overtime, and we've seen your deduction and all these things is just carving out benefits to certain people populations, opposed to making simpler, fair. So, and so that's what we really need to get to at a principal level is to try to get more comprehensive tax to that. But you are absolutely correct, and there are groups that are doing some smart work on this and come up with different tax code redesigns from the tax policy center to the tax foundation. There's a different ideological spectrums. They look at different international taxation sort of reforms, etc. You're alluding to. So the ideas are out there, but we just need to get we need to have a different level of discourse on this that we're just not having. We're having it. What we just had it at was at the how do we design a tax code to give away things as opposed to a broader tax reform of, you know, that achieve some bigger things.
It's spelled.
I was gonna say, that's not right. So I appreciate it. Thank you for this context. I coach district and school leaders, and so I think probably a lot of us heard about Department of Ed being closed, and then the funding was frozen, and then unfrozen. So they're expecting that funding, and as you can imagine, schools were. They've dedicated a lot of specific programs for students, specific staff based on that number. But 5.5 billion is pretty small, given the numbers you just shared with us, and so I love your thoughts on just how. And you shared some, and I really appreciate it, how kind of we get locked into certain things are going to save us money. So closing department, that is something that a lot of people got attached to, is like saving money, and states can afford it, and it's only 10% of what states get, but for some states, it's more than that. How do we message kind of what some of our national spending that goes out to states actually supports in terms of proportion for those states? FEMA is one that's come up for us, like Western Maryland support that we know just didn't get approved. So I just think there's a lot. I'm wondering, how do we spread the message about how federal funding from certain departments and certain programs impact states proportionally different?
Oh, I mean, so there are statistics now, we don't have these, we don't focus as much on the, on sort of state comparison data and things like this, so there are other resources out there that show and have very clear statistics on, you know, how much of a share of a state's budget is coming from federal government, that can break it down by different areas, right? You can do relative rankings, etc. Sometimes those statistics in factor in the other side of the ledger, right? So depending on a state's wealth, you know, a lot of, if they're a wealthier state, a lot of the income taxes, et cetera, in that state are actually going back to it. So it's sort of like this cross-state kind of transfers, et cetera, that kind of happen at a total level. But there's certainly looking at the data of the share of one's state budget that comes from the federal government is one way to get a relative understanding of the state's kind of vulnerability, so to speak, or the susceptibility to different areas. But the thing I would add on to there, this has come up, Dennis has been made different meetings, and I know this has come up at different meetings, Maryland too. And here's the reality, Maryland is, for all sorts of reasons, more dependent on the federal government than on average, okay, for obvious reasons, the proximity to the federal government, the workforce, spillover impacts there, the research and development sort of funding that comes through, et cetera. There's lots of reasons why Maryland is more dependent on the federal government than other states. In my opinion, that would make it even more important for people in Maryland to understand and then talk about what the real drivers are at the federal level on spending programs, right? So the big spending programs are in those healthcare areas and Social Security. So Maryland should therefore be at the forefront of understanding that, because if you don't try to tackle the drivers of this, other areas of the budget are going to continue to get squeezed. That being said, because we're in such a hole, all areas of the budget are going to have to be like on there and be talking about, like anybody would do in a business or individual if you're facing the situation. But I'll just be blunt, Maryland's delegation, I don't think, is talking about the drivers of this. I think that,
We talk about it, then we can spend more money.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's all,
We get
you
it.
know, but it actually gets to your point earlier. I mean, I'm not saying that Maryland, they're obviously not the only state doing this, but. You know, we need leaders in Congress that are actually willing to step up and say, you gotta tackle some of these big drivers, because if you don't, then the ramifications are just gonna keep coming in other parts of the budget that are not squeezed. And so, but that leadership's not there across the board. In terms of the country at large, and that is going back to the question earlier, that's the very shift. I have a different conversation.
Like, who are your natural allies in amplifying the message of urgency to address this? It must be, I can't imagine there are groups that might be opposed to your messaging, but maybe there are. But who are the natural allies to help amplify the whole urgency?
Oh,
Is
there's
it
lots of groups.
finance groups? Really?
Yeah, but there's lots of groups that are opposed to us, when it comes down to the solutions, right? And that's the broader, that's the issue at large here, right? So I think you can get, by and large, most people to agree with you on the principle of the problem. I think most people would agree that it's sort of, oh, yeah, this sounds good, we're spending more on interest than we're spending on defense, what the heck's going on? Right, I think that you can get people to agree on that, but when it comes down to solutions, it's, you got special interest after special interest that wants to look out for their piece of the pie, and so you will definitely, like, there is, when it comes down to how you can solve this, you're going to have numerous people that counter the actual specific solutions of this. Because the solutions are not easy, right? So you gotta keep sight, this is about budgeting and making trade-offs, this isn't about, like. The political system's more bigger giveaways, obviously, than text guys. And so that's where the opponents come out, is on specific solutions. There are countless advocacy groups, and you bring up the topic of Social Security that will attack you at a moment's notice for even bringing up the topic, but they're trying to demagogue it for their own, frankly, their own benefit. So I think that, so there's definitely opponents of this. There are allies too. The business community does tend to understand this and does tend to be a proponent for getting this under control. That being said, I think that many of the business community, as we kind of talked about before, were in favor of many of the provisions that were included in the Speak Beautiful bill, and for understandable reasons worried about the possibility that you could have these tax cuts expire, what the impacts of that would be, and so they were, I don't think they maybe were as forceful as they maybe otherwise would have been to try to kind of make this a more fiscally responsible bill overall. So there are allies, there are opponents on this. I steal from my co-chair on this one too. One of our co-chairs for organizations, he's a former everything title, Secretary of Defense, CIA Director, Budget Director, etc. And he has a saying that he goes, I've been watching a long time, etc. So you solve this problem by leadership or crisis. Right? That's how these things work. He was meaning leadership in terms of doing things that are hard. It may not actually be your political benefit. You're going to come together and work on things for the benefit of a common interest as opposed to your own interests. All these kind of quaint ideas. But that's honestly kind of what it takes. You get allies that are actually going to do smart things. That's kind of where it's lacking now. He feels, a lot of people feel, crisis sort of scenarios potentially more likely. We gotta try and make that not the case.
I have a question. I hear a lot of meetings who speak about it with such a great opposition, like you mentioned.
Yeah.
Other than Dr. Google, someone like me, where would I go if I want to join those who are for talking about finance issue?
Well, you can definitely join us. So you give me your card and I'll CRFB.org, ways to sign up there. I can get you involved, and we often reach out to everybody kind of on our list and give them tools and opportunities to go and speak to policymakers, speak out in the community, host forums, host events. This seems like it is a grassroots kind of thing, and it seems kind of overwhelming, but it's sort of a one step at a time kind of thing. I'll give you an example of that. One of the things that we have done in the past, we're going to do it more for the Social Security effort, but we've done it on the broader debt challenge as well, is you can bring groups of people together in forums. Right? You can do this all sorts of ways, classes, but also large, conferences and business associations, what have you, in all sorts of ways. And they can partake in what's called sort of a simulation or a budget exercise in some ways. And what they do is you can bring big groups of people together. You sit down either with a broader budget or Social Security specifically, and groups like ourselves, other groups done this too, you can give them all the tools they need. So big packets of information, online tools as well. They can work through a simulation over an hour, 2 hours, and negotiate, compromise, do trade-offs, and simulate how you would solve the budget problem, the Social Security problem. There's lots of benefits to that, but one of the benefits of doing that is to try to media coverage for such events, because then it's not just a singular event. You actually get that narrative out there in the media that this is solvable. We can do this. We just show that we can do it here. We can get our policymakers to do it. So I'm telling you that example is an example that might seem like a smaller one event kind of thing, but you then use it to the benefit of trying to impact the policy narrative, because yeah, social media and all this stuff has changed communications and everything, but any political sort of person will still tell you people pay attention to their districts and they will know if an event or something like that is happening in their districts. And may change the political categories.
There's a recent that you may be interested in, it's a bipartisan organization, Maryland Free.
Okay.
Which is a local, locally at the state level organization, and particularly what I find helpful is, resource roll call. So when a politician calls me up or asks me for their vote, I just go to the roll call to understand how they voted on various, bills in the past.
I might need that, that was me.
Yep, and they have, I guess they're quarterly meetings at, Rolling Road Country Club. Yeah, it was probably.
Mike's actually presented
Okay.
at that, I don't know.
Yeah, the guy that heads that up is Dwayne Carey.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what-
And I would also say, just to introduce ourselves, or Van and Steve, we work with Mike in supporting that, and it's their arms and legs in there when they need it. And so, connected with Christy and her team, and so as opportunities arise, really actively engage directly with our delegation. We'll definitely work with Mike as those opportunities rise, and Christy to help keep them informed. That's really kind of the next step after this discussion. Bring you into that fold and then work to keep informed after this conversation.
You've been looking at it, sort of talking about, US debt in isolation. But I think it's important to also look at things from a global perspective as well. And the one, ace that we have is, the amount of global commerce that is done in dollars. So what I think is going to happen in the next, 10 years or so is probably some level of yield control at the federal level to keep interest rates low. Right? And it's, I think the dollar, I mean, if you just look at what the dollar juxtaposed basket of foreign currency over the last 6 months has done, the dollar significantly dropped. And it's why Bitcoin's up to $118 per Bitcoin. So it is, I don't know, I'm not doom and gloom. But to your prior comment, the greatest impetus for change is a certain level of pain. And I don't think the populace as a whole has had enough pain to make a lot of the changes that are necessary.
Yeah, so the thing I'd say on that is. So. We have a lot of things going for us in the United States of America relative to the rest of the world. It's why we are more, like, if you were a different country. Okay, in a different part of the world that had this sort of numbers, you would have already been in a fiscal crisis a long time ago. Okay, but we have a lot of things going for us in the United States. We are the world's still global reserve currency. We still are now biggest economy, all sorts of very big underlying factors why there's a lot going for us, and why the inevitable day of reckoning is much farther away than maybe it would be somewhere else. I think all of that is without a doubt true. At the same time, you see sort of inklings of things like, and some of the things that have happened over the last few months, and we've had days that were all of a sudden treasury yields kind of spiked, again, not necessarily because of this issue, but other reasons, and kind of gave people some kind of momentary pause, like, whoa, hold on a second, like some of those bigger things that we have come to expect with the stability of the US economy globally, maybe they're not as built in permanently as people would think. The whole deal here, it's like a quaint word, right? Prudent. Right, the prudent idea here is to not test this long term. The prudent idea here is to get out ahead of this, get compounding working for you when you know this is just, it is unsustainable, right? It's unsustainable to have your debt growing faster than the underlying economy, and have those interest costs just feeding on themselves. It's just unsustainable. So it's more prudent to get out ahead of this, not test those underlying macroeconomic trends, they may exist for a while. But there are other negative ramifications, at least of why you need to get ahead of this, that I kind of outlined before. And then the ultimate negative one, fiscal crisis, might be a long ways off the pain that we're talking about. But again, it's about trying to get a sense of being more prudent into our system, which obviously sounds outrageous, frankly, we need to say, but that's kind of the idea.
So we have unfortunately gone over our time for this morning, but this is an excellent conversation. Everyone here is welcome to stay. Continue chatting. We have breakfast in the kitchen and consult yourselves. But I do want to thank Steve, Amanda, and Mike, especially for sharing such great information with us and all the wonderful work that you all do. And we look forward to partnering with you more in the future. We do have a lot of upcoming events coming up through August and September, but I think it's September 22nd. We are having another similar seminar with Tom Barkin from the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Great. Following this event, I'll reach out to everybody who was registered with information on CRFB so they can stay in touch with you, as well as information on the Federal Reserve webinar. So thank you all for being here. Thank you guys from CRFB, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you. So, it's, I,